Hello, and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On this episode, I want to kind of expand on where I left off last week when I was talking about self-objectification and self-sexualization, how it's been monetized and spun, and then we kind of wrap ourselves in the sword and shield effect of also victimization so these things can transpire. But building on that, on this episode, I really want to talk about exhibitionism. More specifically, what is exhibitionistic disorder and how some people are skirting the lines within the community between these two issues. First, we need to understand what the disorder is. So it's a condition that's marked by the urge or fantasy coupled with the fact of exposing your genitals to non-consenting people, more specifically strangers, somebody you don't know. Now, one of the key phrases I want to keep in mind, especially in the world of BDSM, is that we always talk about consent. So this issue here completely exists without consent. The condition itself is considered part of the paraphilic disorder range, which means it refers to a persistent and intense sexual arousal patterns that are accompanied by clinically significant distress or impairment, but the need and compulsion to do so are overwhelming. People with this disorder have a preference to show their genitalia to sometimes children, most of the time adults, on occasion it's both. A lot of the times people deny that they'll expose themselves to others or that they'll even say that doing so doesn't cause them any personal harm or they're not stressed out by this. But if they're actually doing these things, especially repeatedly in a non-consenting way, they still could receive a diagnosis of being an exhibitionist under this disorder. That usually has to be done in a clinical setting, so they're sitting down, we're going through tests, and then there is a range for it. Most disorders have to be persistent for at least about 6 months. It's treatable with psychotherapy, support groups, and in some cases medications such as antidepressants. The prevalence of exhibitionist disorder are unknown in the general public, but it's thought in a larger scale that anywhere between 3 and 5% of the total population, for example in the United States, specifically males, is affected by this disorder. Now, while the condition is not as prevalent in women, there is a growing number of women that are starting to exhibit the signs of this disorder. The prevalence is only an estimate at this point because realistically, females don't report the disorder as much. They tend to play it off as something else. Sometimes they'll even monetize it. So we see this in modeling or in stripping. Acts of exhibitionism, though, and the disorder itself are quite distinct. Exhibitionism involves exposing your genitals to become excited, more specifically sexually aroused, and experiencing these urges to be observed by others. It's almost a need or a compulsion, sometimes during sexual activity. The disorder, though, involves acting on those urges or fantasies, and then you're also distressed by them or you're unable to function because of them. So with this diagnosis, it can be made with, like I said prior, there's criteria that has to be met. First off, it has to be continuing for about 6 months. And you have to have these recurrent or intense sexually arousing fantasies that involve exposing yourself to a non-consenting person. The second part is that you've acted out on this. So you've actually gone out in public and you're doing this. The disorder is categorized into subgroups and subtypes based on whether a person refers to himself or herself and she or he is more targeting adults or children or a combination of the two. Like many other paraphilias, though, individuals can exhibit these exhibitionistic urges and act sporadically or occasionally without necessarily having the disorder. And this is kind of where FetLife has come into it. We kind of see this crossover where people are acting out on these fantasies, and for the most part, in reality, when we see images like on FetLife or alt.com, BDSM.com, cuffs, collar me, these people are self-described exhibitionists. They enjoy the fact that they are being viewed by others. Now, for the most part, it's fairly harmless. Where the adults are consenting, they know when they go there, this is what they're seeing. Unfortunately, they don't know if the photography or the images that are being set forth are being viewed by children, because there's no way to really regulate that, especially in something that's not regulated through a legal means, meaning it's not required ID. With that being said, there does become a point when we're getting close to skirting the line, and this is the issue that it really is starting to come to the forefront of what I'm starting to see in social media, even on places more forefront like Instagram, which is pretty stringent on what can and can't be done, because people get very creative and tactile about how they present their exhibitionism. Twitter doesn't have any real regards. They've kind of put it more behind the wall now. At least you have to have a Twitter account, I think, from the way I understand it, to view some of this more pornographic type imagery. But a classic example of exhibitionism is when we've been at a sporting event or we're watching something on TV, and all of a sudden we see a streaker, right? They get naked, they strip off their clothes, they run into the field during halftime or even during a play, and everyone sees them. Now, most of the part, they'll say, oh, this was just a joke, I just did this. And for them, they could be right. But the reality is they're still exhibiting themselves. They're still exposing themselves. Another example we're starting to see in growing numbers are people exposing themselves on public transportation, buses, on subway systems, airplanes. And they're not only exposing themselves openly, but they're starting to expose themselves openly to others. This rise I'm starting to see, obviously, in places like FetLife or Collar Me or Alt, which are highly dominated, the top or the most popular people, which they put forth in the community a representation. It doesn't definitely represent the entire community, but they're putting forth a representation of what they call exhibitionism and what they believe it is. And this goes back to what I was saying last week, where they're objectifying and sexualizing themselves and then requesting engagement. And then when they receive the engagement, they then turn to the shield part, which is the victimization, because they don't enjoy people making comments that are overly sexualized, even though they're asking for a sexualized response. But now they're taking this exhibitionism and moving into the public sphere. So one of the big tenements that we understand about BDSM is that we practice in a safe manner, in a sane manner, and we practice consensually. The first two parts of that, safe and sane, well, those are subjective. What's safe for me is not going to be safe for you. What's sane for me is not necessarily sane for you. But consensual is one thing that we can all agree upon, that I have to have the agreement of the other participant to get involved. But lately, as I'm starting to see people, no, it's not even lately, it's probably been a trend more so for the last few years. And I'm kind of waiting for something on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok at all. I don't follow it. But I listen to the stories, but I'm kind of waiting for these challenges to arise of, hey, who's going to expose themselves in the most daring place? People masturbating at restaurants. Well, this no longer covers you under the veil of just being an exhibitionist. This now goes into the paraphilic side, into the disorder side, because you're not only tempting fate, you're breaking the law, and you're exposing others to your fetish without their consent. Now, for a community that is wrapped in nothing but consent, and we preach about this all the time, I talk about it when I do classes or I go and speak at events. I talk about consent constantly, among other things. But consent being one of the paramount foundations of the lifestyle, you can't get consent from others, but they want to get the thrill. The moment these people are called out for it, men or women, then they wrap themselves in the victimization, or they'll say, well, this is all about empowerment. It's not. It's neither. That's a lie. You are exposing yourselves to others without their consent. And that is, beyond that, there is no argument. There is no discussion. So why are we doing it? Well, that's when it starts getting trickier. We can't really decide that line that we're crossing. But if you have to start asking yourself whether or not the behavior is healthy versus unhealthy, more specifically, if somebody's consenting to it or not. And people will say to me, well, how, if I'm involved with somebody and I want to send them nudes, well, that's fine. You've already consented to some sort of sexual activity or pre-negotiated things that you want to do inside of your relationship. And in some cases, that's fine. There's no serious psychological forces at work here. But even for men who are sending unsolicited nude pictures, that's now becoming a different area or even women who are doing it, we're getting to the point it's starting to violate the laws of society. And that does have to go both ways. It is one thing where I'm starting to see people complain that, and I don't want to digress here too much, but people complain if I see a profile avatar. So if you're unfamiliar with an avatar, but we should all know what those are by now. An avatar is a little picture of something on your profile. So some people it's cats, for some people it's their six-pack, for some men it's their penises, for some women it's their vaginas or breasts. But that's fine. If you're on an adult website, you're already consenting to what you're seeing. But we're now getting to the point where we're pushing those boundaries, and what we're saying to people is, nope, I don't want to see that. That's not okay. But seeing all of me, I'm empowered. I'm releasing my sexual, threshold out onto the world. Well, that's fine, but unfortunately, the laws of society don't deem it that way. And I don't want to digress too much. One question I get, and because this isn't my biggest area of speciality, so I have deferred to a friend of mine who is a clinician. But some questions I got a chance to ask were like, do exhibitionists typically suffer from other disorders? Or is there more going on with them than them just wanting to exposing themselves? Because there's such little research on what causes exhibitionistic disorder, or the research that currently exists, it's mainly and strictly focused on men. I mean, almost every clinical trial, it's all focused on men. And then those trials are even drawn more specifically from the criminal justice system. So somebody's gone out, we've all heard about flashers, or if not, look it up. But men running around in trench coats, exposing themselves and running off. Of course, then they get arrested. And then they are treated or talked to in the prison system or in the court system. But the reality is we're not talking to them about the rest of their psychological mindset. We are just talking to them about why they conducted the activity they did. We do know that, or there's an understanding that this disorder, exhibitionistic disorder, can be coupled with a multitude of things, being depressive, possibly bipolar. You might be heavily using substances, whether it's drugs or alcohol. Anxiety, hypersexuality, adult ADHD, So on the very rare cases, some people even exhibit signs of antisocial personality disorder. The thing is, though, when we start to look at all of these different factors, when does it start to set in? When does this start to cross the threshold of beyond what we're thinking about and what we're imagining to start doing? Most men that have been interviewed in a lot of these clinical cases or clinical trials, they've been aware of their sexual urges to start exposing themselves, that they only get aroused doing this act in their formative teen years, so early adolescence, just prepubescence. It usually in some cases there has been, men have regarded that they would start exposing themselves to like the TV, so what they would imagine, and from there, as it goes forward, they decide whether they're going to take it real world or not. Now, we do have to understand that with women, female exhibitionists, they may not fully even understand that they have this condition at all. They just, again, it has been wrapped in a veil of sexual empowerment, and they may exploit this condition. So they might go into something like topless dancing, pole dancing, cam modeling, modeling in general. Some women engage in a form of exhibition by dressing in front of their windows at home so their neighbors can see. There's a paradox here, though. While the psychologists believe that obviously the bigger problem lies within the male population, there is, again, and I said this before, we don't really understand how big it is of an issue with women. It's not that it's rare. It's just that there's not enough data to start putting it forward. And there's clinical trials going on now. Now, some women engage in this form of exhibition by, wearing low-cut gowns, or they'll wear skirts, they won't wear any underwear, and then there's always this whole, well, I'm empowered, or I don't like to wear underwear. But if there's a given point where you're exposing yourself to somebody who is non-consenting, you have premeditated what you are doing. So this falls within this category. Some interesting statistics, though, about exhibitionists in general. About 70% of all exhibitionists, both male and female, are in a relationship. About 50% of them are married. That's quite interesting because you're starting to understand, if you're in a relationship with somebody else, especially, if we look at the lifestyle itself, we're talking about something that is extremely sexually overt. But we're sharing images online, we're sharing images with each other, we're sharing images with our partner, but then that need grows. This is why they think that there's a potential crossover with other disorders. We're also like, one of the disorders, I don't think I mentioned it, was attention-seeking behavior. That, coupled with exhibitionism, and they get often confused, can become highly problematic, because now we're at the point where we're pushing ourselves to do more risque exhibitionism and pushing that envelope, so then we can in turn get the high and release that dopamine reaction and serotonin reaction when we get all those likes on our photos, when we're out having sex on an airplane, or we are on a train and masturbating on a train, whether or not it's just in front of our partner, but with the potentiality of others seeing. The problem with all of these things now is we push this envelope for being more well-known in social medias, is that as we cross this over, we are, again, I'm keep coming back to this, we're violating the consent of others. That's not what the lifestyle is about. I do blame some of the places that have called themselves lifestyle only or BDSM only, Collar Me, Alt.com, even FetLife, because they have marred what they initially, in my opinion, marred what they've stood for, and have allowed other groups to come in, and it kind of turns it into this competing competition atmosphere, and who can do what and expose themselves where, and it's on a daily basis. I'm not going to say that every person that I view on there doing these things has this disorder, but the reality is, I don't know. I mean, I'm not that clinician. I don't specialize in that area. I'm a trauma-informed therapist. That's what I do. But looking at this, the reason why I'm diving into this subject is because there are those who are just exhibitionists that slowly start out and they want to just model themselves. They want to bring themselves into the community. They feel a little bit more comfortable. So here comes the flip side of all of this. They put themselves online and they get a response. So that response then becomes more aggressive. Show us your chest. They expose their chest, male or female, doesn't matter. All right, great. We want to see more. It becomes the never-ending syndrome. You can no longer feed the beast anymore because they're constantly pushing you to do more extreme content. As far as publishing if you're putting up a blog or if you're putting up a post coupled with photographs, or it's just photographs or it's just videos. All of your quote-unquote followers, these people that you have very limited interaction with, now start to push the envelope again, and the aggressive requests start to take over. Men will start to highly sexualize themselves and put up their sexual conquest, quote-unquote, which then reflects them again in a poor light. We go back to the male stereotype of this is what we are after, the conquest, and we're posting our conquests online. That fad tends to run out very quickly. But with women, it seems to be more invasive, so they'll expose their breasts, and maybe it'll even start off there just in their bra, and then they go to their breasts, but then it's just them in their underwear with their breasts, and then it's a consistent and an aggressive attack to get them to expose more and more, until the point that exhibitionist side of themselves has also been overrun by the mob that they're wanting to cater to and desire the reciprocity from. Long-term trauma from this, sleeping issues, eating disorders, nightmares, night terrors. I've seen it and I've worked with it. But the problem that I have within the community itself is now, as I see women and claiming this under the veil of female empowerment, are women going to supermarkets, going on trains, going to restaurants, masturbating at these places. Again, we're violating consent. It's the same thing can be said for men when I see men, but men tend not to do this as much. So they're not going to a location per se to expose themselves. They're exposing themselves to other people. But I'm failing to understand why, as a community, when I see this, why we're cheering this on. Many times I've seen this, and it doesn't matter who it is. I've condemned just as many men on social media as I have women. I'm trying to think if that number is even more, but reality is I don't see as many men's photos or videos rise to the level that we do of women. But at what point, do these social and sexual relationships that we're having with us and our audience takes over who we are, and we're giving up that part of our identity to push into a realm that we once thought was harmless, now is becoming a part of our lives we have to take over? Because once you begin this and go down this route, what ends up happening is that this is who you are. You have to push each day, go to a new place. Now, if you're out in the mountains and no one's around and you're getting nude for some art, okay. If somebody unsuspectingly happens upon your camp, yep, you can call that an accident. But when it's a stranger and it's someone you don't know and you're at the McDonald's and you're sitting in the corner and there's kids around, it's problematic. When you're on a train full of busy commuters at 5 o'clock rush hour and you found some secret corner and you're lifting your skirt up and exposing, you're not wearing any underwear, and you're exposing your genitals while you're masturbating, that's problematic. If you are at a baseball game and decide to have sex with your partner in the stands and you think that's really cool and it was some sort of magic rush and you're going to post that all over social media, there's nothing great about that. Because now what we're doing is we are disregarding the consent, we're disregarding trust and respect of everybody else that we're in a community with outside of our community to satiate our own needs. And that's not healthy. That's problematic. And as I see all of this grow, it's just, for me, exhibitionism has always been something that's obviously more reserved. As social media has really come into its own in the last 15, 20 years, this style of disorder, this style of putting yourself out there, of taking command of your own presence, and the two do walk a very fine line, has really exploded in the last 20 years. Now, while exhibitionism, as a matter of fact, in the States, each state has its own law and its own penal code where punishments can start with fines. Some can be, felonies as far as like a, third-class felony. But we have to start asking ourselves as a society, as a community, if that we're cheering people on and pushing them, what's it say about the people who are being aggressive and pushing versus the people who are responding to that aggressiveness, responding to that pushiness, and going out and continuing the problem? Well, it's a twofold effect. There are plenty of people in the BDSM community that conduct their exhibitionism privately. It's done at dungeons or private events, and that's fine. It's contained. I just think now that what we're starting to see is no longer contained. The cat's kind of out of the bag. And I'm not suggesting that everybody that's doing this has the disorder or needs treatment. But I think we have to start stepping back as a community and start looking at the issue going, are we starting to push the boundaries just to push the boundaries? Or are we pushing the boundaries because this is who we are, and then there might be something more beyond that we need to talk about? But because we're in a hypersexualized community, we tend to overlook all of this. And to me, that becomes the bigger problem. So I think it's cause for reflection. And while I know, I don't have the largest reach yet, my audience is growing and people are starting to understand, whether people take on board what I'm saying or think that I'm completely left field and I don't know what I'm talking about. Do your own research, look it up. I'm not quoting or talking about anything that's not already out there. But I think we're kind of getting at a point in the community where such sexualization is just commonplace, that we believe that exposing oneself is the status quo. Well, this is not 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. This isn't the Grecian or Roman empires. We're walking around with no clothes on and taking what we want or doing what we want. Even though people put those imagery online, that's not how the world works. It's not even the world they live in. That's a small world that they're wanting to make believe to others is what this lifestyle is about, or is a large part of it. Exhibitionism is a small fetish within the greater community. It just has a larger following. Maybe it's time for all of us to rethink what exhibitionism truly means and to what lengths we're really willing to go to please those that follow us or like our posts or love our photographs or comment on them. Maybe we need to start rethinking how that really falls within the BDSM community, how it falls in the fetish community on a grander scale, and what it represents for us when we're starting to involve people that aren't a part of our lifestyle and stripping away their consent for a couple clicks of a love or a like or a comment on social media. It's something to think about. Until next time, everyone, be safe and stay kinky.